And then if we look at again at the empirical record, we find that financial crises have persisted in spite of this massive regulation and in spite of this presence of the government and in spite of paper monetary system. So we had just in the past 38 years, ever since we have a paper money system, we had financial crisis in 1973, 1974, and I just mentioned only the worldwide significant financial crisis. So 1973-74, 1982 or 1980-82, 1987, 2000, and now 2007-2008. Now, so apparently, and I'm not counting any minor hiccups or regional crisis, right? The collapse of the ruble and the tequila crisis in Mexico and Asian meltdown in '97 and so on, right? So just major crises that covered virtually the entire Western world or the world financial markets. So we had them despite this massive regulation. Now, of course, you can say that regulation was simply not strong enough. Right? This would be a logically possible response. Okay, so we had massive regulation, but it was still not strong enough. And the other answer would be, well, okay, I mean, clearly regulation either simply did not solve this problem or might actually have amplified the problem. And I will argue the latter case, namely that regulation, first of all, did not at all address the causes of these crises, and second, actually what it did was to amplify the crisis. So why does it not, or did it not solve these past crises, and why would regulation not solve our present crisis? Well, mainly, essentially because it does not solve the moral hazard problem. If you have a casserole, right, with water in it, and you start boiling it, you have fire under your pot, then necessarily there will be steam coming out of it. The steam could be, now in our metaphor, could be a crisis. Something happens and you don't like this to happen. Now, look, you could have the idea that you simply put something on the pot, covering it and so preventing this. But of course what this will do is simply increase the pressure, and then finally the whole thing will explode. Otherwise, in order to prevent that the water steams out of your pot, you've got to fight, you've got to attack the cause. And if you're not willing to do this, well, you shouldn't be surprised that the problem doesn't go away and that it might actually even deteriorate. Now, the crucial thing is that financial regulation, that is giving access or denying access to markets and regulating business practices, does not attack the moral hazard problem. As long as regulators do not prescribe or give not a complete description of any single activity that has to be, can be made by a financial company, there's still the possibility for a company that is only partially regulated to simply start investing in segments of the market that are not yet so regulated. That is actually what we have again observed since the early 1980s, when there occurred a massive deregulation of financial markets. Lots of new segments were created. Now it's a very innovative market, in particular in the, well, derivatives segment. So what happens there is each time the government steps in to regulate one of these instruments, is that the companies invent new ones for which no regulations exist yet. And then, of course, in trading these new ones, at the very least, you have the moral hazard problem, that is excessive risk-taking, low equity, and so on. But I think the problem would persist even if we had a full regulation. That is, if we imagined that we turned financial markets into some sort of a Nazi economy. Right? So the Nazi economy was characterized by full description of any legitimate activity, so we tell bankers what type of thing they can sell and what they may not sell and so on. It would persist even in such a case because as long as we keep the pricing process free, right, there still exists the problem of evaluation, the proper evaluation of the assets. Of course, so the only solution out would be not only to regulate all activities, but also to impose a system of fixed prices for all financial assets. Well, then of course you have solved the problem, but that's like killing the patient. Okay? You can solve his terrible illness and so on by stabbing a knife in his heart, and then he no longer suffers from this condition, but he is dead. So same thing for the financial markets. The only way to solve this problem, imposing all prices and so on, well, you no longer have a financial market. Okay. So meanwhile, then, while you still do not solve the moral hazard problem, what you do by regulation is to increase the costs of doing business. You reduce competition by creating barriers to entry, and by prescribing certain business activities, while you deter business practice from the most profitable ways that it would otherwise have taken. So it becomes less efficient. Otherwise said, the cost per unit of product increase. So capital allocation, and what Ludwig Lachmann, a well-known Austrian economist, once called the division of capital. Okay, an analogy to the division of labor, there's a division of capital. The division of capital is artificially reduced. So the productivity of marginal productivity of financial instruments is reduced. Now, what we have seen here is that regulation creates certain unintended consequences, and I will examine these such consequences in just a little bit more detail now, again, in the case of a particular type of financial regulation. How much time do I still have? 20 minutes, okay, that will be sufficient. Namely the Basel agreements, for international bank regulation. So these agreements have been made by experts organized in a so-called Basel Committee, which includes representatives from the major central banks of the world, and is a committee of the Bank for International Settlements. Just a little word on the Bank for International Settlements. It was created in 1930 in order to help settle German wartime debt. Now we're talking about World War I here, okay? 3 years later, it was already defunct because Hitler refused to pay anymore debt. Okay, and then you might have thought that the bank would disappear, but as bureaucracies do not function according to these rules, right? So what it did was to find a new mission, and it struggled for 3 decades or so to find new missions, and then finally it focused on international regulation. Okay, somebody needs to take care of international regulation. We cannot just let the markets work without us, without somebody telling them how to behave properly. And so the Basel Committee was the first one of today 5 or 6 committees discussing various aspects of international financial regulation. And it was created in the early 1960s. Then we had roughly 2 decades of discussions, and then finally in 1988 a first agreement was reached that we today call the Basel I Agreement. We call it the Basel I Agreement because it was followed in 2004 by a second agreement that went beyond this, the so-called Basel II Agreement. And what the essential stipulation of these agreements concerns minimum equity ratios for banks and other financial firms. So the idea is that banks should hold 8% of equity for their investments. This we find already in Basel I, so 1988, and in Basel II then we have the same essential stipulation plus 2 other elements, namely procedures or suggestions for procedures of evaluating risks. That's the second pillar of the Basel II agreement, and the third pillar is market publicity, so facilitating information flow from banks or other financial intermediaries to the rest of the market and to their customers in particular.